Sunnyside. A good name, it was a good place. Quiet streets, friendly neighbours, kids played on sidewalks, people walked their dogs. Not much happened in Sunnyside, until it did. Then everything changed. The first sign was the mail, piling up, uncollected, then the curtains, drawn shut day and night. Unusual for Mrs. Helen Bailey, a creature of habit. She always took pride in her home, always kept things tidy. Neighbours started to talk, whispering on porches. Something was wrong. The scene that greeted them was horrific. Mrs. Bailey lay on the bed, still. Her eyes stared vacantly at the ceiling. Her face, once so full of life, was now pale, lifeless. The smell was overpowering, the sweetness of decay. Death had come to Sunnyside. News travelled fast in a small town like Sunnyside. Soon, the street was filled with flashing lights, police cars, an ambulance. Neighbours gathered, watching from behind yellow tape, whispering, speculating. Who could have done this? Why? Mrs. Bailey was a kind woman. Everyone agreed. A pillar of the community. She volunteered at the library, baked pies for the church bake sale, always had a smile for everyone. Who would want to hurt her? Fear spread through Sunnyside like a virus. The sense of safety, once so strong, was shattered. People locked their doors, kept their children close. The shadow that had fallen over Sunnyside grew darker, more menacing. The police started their investigation, questioning neighbours, looking for clues, anything that could lead them to the killer. Who was Mrs. Bailey? Did she have any enemies? Anyone who would want her dead? The investigation was just beginning. But one thing was clear. This was no ordinary crime. This was personal. Section 5. The early investigation. Detective John Riley arrived on the scene, a seasoned detective. He'd seen it all, or so he thought, but this case was different. Something about it felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, not yet. The medical examiner confirmed what Riley already suspected. Murder. Mrs. Bailey had been strangled. No signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle. It was as if she knew her killer, trusted them even. Section 1. The silent house. The house stood silent, a crime scene frozen in time. Riley walked through each room carefully, methodically, looking for anything out of place, anything that could be a clue. A fingerprint, a hair, a fibre, anything. The living room was tidy, too tidy, as if someone had cleaned up, but not well enough. There was a faint smell of bleach in the air, an attempt to mask the scent of something else, something sinister. The kitchen told a similar story. Dishes washed and put away, counters wiped clean, but there was a single glass on the counter, a half-finished glass of water, as if someone had left in a hurry. Upstairs, the bedrooms were equally sterile, except for Mrs. Bailey's room, the scene of the crime. The air was heavy there, suffocating. Riley could still sense the fear that had gripped Mrs. Bailey in her final moments. Section 2. Unlocking the past. Riley knew the key to solving this case lay in Mrs. Bailey's past. Who was she? What were her secrets? He started with her phone records. Her last call was to her daughter Sarah, 2 days ago. A routine check-in, nothing unusual. Next, he looked into her finances. No large withdrawals, no suspicious transactions. Mrs. Bailey lived a simple life. She didn't have much, but what she had, she earned honestly. Riley moved on to her social media. Mrs. Bailey was active online. She had a Facebook page, an Instagram account. She posted regularly about her life, her garden, her baking, her grandchildren. There was no indication of any trouble, no threats, no enemies. Section 3. A web of relationships. Riley shifted his focus to Mrs. Bailey's relationships. Her husband, Frank, had passed away 5 years ago. Heart attack. They'd been married for 40 years, by all accounts a happy marriage. Could there be more to the story? Riley tracked down Frank's brother, Edward. Edward lived in a nursing home on the outskirts of town. He was frail, his memory was fading, but he remembered his brother, and he remembered Helen. He spoke of them fondly, with a hint of sadness. Riley learned that Frank had a heart condition. He'd been on medication for years. Edward didn't know the details, but he remembered his brother complaining about the side effects, the fatigue, the nausea, the headaches. Could Frank's death have been more than just a heart attack? Riley couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. Section 4, The Handyman's Story. Riley turned his attention to Mrs. Bailey's neighbours. He learned that she had a handyman, Tom. Tom had been helping her around the house for years, odd jobs, repairs, yard work. Tom was brought in for questioning. He was cooperative, almost too cooperative. He said he had last seen Mrs. Bailey on Monday afternoon. He had stopped by to fix a leaky faucet. He said she seemed fine, happy even. Tom's story checked out. His alibi was solid. He had been at work at the time of the murder. But Riley couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about Tom, something he wasn't saying. Section 5, Skeletons in the Closet. Riley decided to dig deeper into Tom's past. He discovered that Tom had a criminal record, petty theft, DUI, nothing violent. But it was enough to raise a red flag. Riley also learned that Tom had been struggling financially. He was behind on his rent. His car had been repossessed. He was desperate. Could he have killed Mrs. Bailey for money? Riley visited Tom's landlord. The landlord said that Tom had been acting strangely lately. He was withdrawn, paranoid. He had also noticed that Tom had a new phone, a top-of-the-line model, more than he could afford. Where did Tom get the money for a new phone? Riley was starting to think that Tom wasn't as innocent as he seemed. Just when Riley thought the case couldn't get any stranger, it did. Mrs. Bailey's car was missing. It wasn't in the garage. It wasn't parked on the street. It was gone, vanished without a trace. The police issued an all-points bulletin for the missing vehicle, a silver Honda Civic, license plate number ABC 123. The car was last seen on Tuesday afternoon, around the time of the murder. Riley knew that finding the car was crucial to solving the case. The car could hold valuable evidence, fingerprints, DNA, the murder weapon, anything. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. But the case remained unsolved. The police had no leads, no suspects, no witnesses. It was as if Mrs. Bailey's killer had vanished into thin air. The investigation had hit a dead end. The police were no closer to finding Mrs. Bailey's killer than they were on that first day. The shadow that had fallen over Sunnyside remained, darker than ever. But Riley refused to give up. He knew that someone out there knew something. Someone held the key to unlocking this mystery. He just had to find them. Sunnyside was a town in mourning. The vibrant energy, the friendly smiles, all replaced by a somber quiet. The shadow of Mrs. Bailey's murder loomed large. The park where children once played was now a makeshift memorial. Flowers wilted beneath a growing pile of teddy bears. Candles flickered, their flames a fragile testament to a life cut short. Detective Riley felt the weight of the town's grief. He saw it in the eyes of the shop owners, heard it in the hushed whispers of neighbours. Sunnyside deserved answers. He was determined to find them. He spent hours, days retracing his steps, re-examining evidence, interviewing and re-interviewing witnesses. He refused to believe Mrs. Bailey's killer had simply vanished. Every dead end fueled his determination. He wouldn't let Sunnyside down. He wouldn't let Mrs. Bailey down. He would find her killer. Weeks crawled by. The trail had gone cold. Then one morning a break. A call from the State Crime Lab. They had a match, a partial fingerprint. lifted from the water glass in Mrs. Bailey's kitchen. The print belonged to a man named David Miller, a small-time criminal with a history of assault and petty theft. He drifted from town to town, always a step ahead of the law. Could this be their guy? Excitement crackled through the investigation. Finally, a solid lead. Riley put out an APB on Miller, his picture plastered on wanted posters across the state. The hunt was on. But Miller, true to form, was nowhere to be found. He had vanished, a phantom melting back into the shadows. The initial hope began to fade. Just as Riley was about to resign himself to another dead end, a plain brown envelope arrived on his desk. No return address, no name, just the Sunnyside postmark. Inside, a single sheet of paper. The words typed in a spidery font, each letter uneven, as if typed on an old malfunctioning typewriter. The message read, "You're looking in the wrong places." She knew her killer. The message was chilling. A taunt, a warning, or a genuine attempt to help? Riley reread the note, his gut twisting. Who sent this, and what did they know? The sender claimed Mrs. Bailey knew her killer. If true, this changed everything. It narrowed the field of suspects, shifting the focus to those closest to her. The letter, while unsettling, provided a new direction. Riley needed to re-examine Mrs. Bailey's relationships, this time searching for a hidden darkness. The investigation took an unexpected turn when a stranger arrived in Sunnyside. A man calling himself Robert Clark, claiming to be a distant relative of Helen Bailey. He'd only just heard about her passing, he said, his voice laced with grief. Clark was a charmer. He had an answer for every question, a story for every occasion. He claimed to have been out of the country, hence the delayed arrival. His grief, he insisted, was the reason for his quiet arrival in Sunnyside. Riley, however, was suspicious. Something about Clark felt off. His story was too smooth, his grief too practiced. And something about his arrival, just as the case was going cold, seemed more than coincidence. Riley decided to look into Clark. He contacted other jurisdictions, searching for any records. Clark, it turned out, wasn't his real name. The man was a chameleon, a master of disguise. Section 5, The Drifter. Riley dug deeper, uncovering a past shrouded in deceit and petty crime. Clark, it seemed, was a drifter, a con man who preyed on vulnerable individuals, often widows mourning the loss of their spouses. His arrival in Sunnyside just weeks after Helen Bailey's murder was no coincidence. He was drawn to vulnerability, to the opportunity to exploit grief for his own gain. The missing car, Riley realized, wasn't just a random detail. It was a vital clue. Clark was known for using stolen vehicles to move from town to town, disappearing before his victims realized they'd been duped. Clark, the charming stranger, was now the prime suspect in Helen Bailey's murder. His arrival in Sunnyside, his web of lies, and his history of preying on vulnerable women painted a damning picture. Section 6. Shifting sands. The investigation was thrown into a frenzy. All hands on deck to locate Robert Clark and, more importantly, find Helen Bailey's missing car. The once quiet town was now swarming with police officers and volunteers. The media descended upon Sunnyside, hungry for any scrap of information about the case. The story of the charming stranger who turned out to be a con man, a potential murderer, captivated the nation. Every passing day, without a sign of Clark or the car, increased the tension. The once hopeful atmosphere in Sunnyside, the belief that justice would be served, began to sour, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The investigation, once focused on a local crime, had expanded, crossing state lines, morphing into a nationwide manhunt. The stakes were higher than ever. Section 1. False trails. Days turned into weeks. Weeks stretched into a month. The search for Robert Clark and Helen Bailey's missing car continued, but each passing day brought more frustration, fewer leads. Dead end after dead end greeted Riley and his team. Tips poured in from across the state, each one raising hopes, only to be dashed against the rocks of Clark's cunning and ability to vanish into thin air. A sighting at a truck stop in a neighbouring state turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. An abandoned car matching the description of Mrs. Bailey's vehicle was found stripped and torched in a junkyard, only for the VIN number to reveal a different story. Clark, it seemed, was always one step ahead, a phantom taunting them from the shadows, leaving behind a trail of false leads and dashed hopes. Just when the investigation seemed destined to stall completely, a promising lead emerged. A park ranger at a remote campground 2 counties over reported seeing a man matching Clark's description. He'd been camping alone, paying in cash and keeping to himself. The ranger, an avid watcher of true crime shows, recognized Clark from a news report about the Sunnyside case and contacted the authorities. He even remembered a partial license plate number which matched the one registered to Mrs. Bailey's missing car. This time, the lead felt different. It wasn't just a sighting, it was tangible evidence, a connection to the missing car and potentially to the murder itself. A sense of urgency gripped the team as they secured the campsite and began combing the area for any sign of Clark. Had they finally cornered their suspect? The campsite yielded a treasure trove of evidence. Discarded food wrappers, empty cigarette packs, and a crumpled receipt from a nearby gas station all pointed to Clark's recent presence. Riley, heart-pounding, pulled up the gas station's security footage. There, clear as day, was Robert Clark, filling up the silver Honda Civic, his face illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights. They had him, or so they thought. The footage also revealed that Clark had left the gas station just minutes before the Rangers' call. He was long gone, one step ahead once again. The man was a ghost, always one step ahead, taunting them with his ability to disappear. But this time, they had something more than just a ghost. They had a direction. The manhunt intensified, expanding northward following the trail of stolen credit card charges and gas station sightings. Clark, it seemed, was heading towards the state border, his every move a calculated step in a deadly game of cat and mouse. But with each passing mile, each dead-end lead, Riley couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Clark was cunning, yes, but this felt different. It was as if he was deliberately leading them on a wild goose chase. The stolen credit card charges, always one step ahead of them, were for paltry amounts. Gasoline, fast food, a cheap motel room. These weren't the actions of a man trying to disappear. They were breadcrumbs deliberately left behind. Clark was toying with them, using their own determination against them, turning the manhunt into a twisted game of smoke and mirrors. But why? The answer lay in revisiting the beginning. Riley returned to Sunnyside, to Helen Bailey's silent house. He walked through the rooms, searching for something he'd missed. His eyes were drawn to a framed photograph. Helen Bailey with a younger woman, both smiling brightly. The inscription read, "To my dearest friend Helen, with love, Martha." A chill snaked down Riley's spine. Clark was a diversion, a phantom. He rushes to his car, grabbing his phone. "Get me everything we have on Martha." As Riley mobilized his team, a second letter arrived at his desk, confirming his suspicions. It was typed on the same aged typewriter, the words crooked, the message chilling in its simplicity. The letter was unsigned, but Riley knew instinctively who had sent it. Martha. She had been their informant all along, feeding them false leads, guiding them away from herself while ensuring Clark remained their prime suspect. He picks up the letter, his fingers gripping the edges, his knuckles turning white. His face is a mask of anger and a growing sense of disgust. He mutters under his breath, "You're good, Martha. Very good, but not good enough." He thought back to his conversations with Martha, to her carefully constructed facade of grief, her detailed accounts of Helen's life, her insistence that Helen had no enemies. It was all a lie, a carefully woven web of deceit. But why? What possible motive could Martha have for killing her supposed best friend? Riley knew the answer lay in unraveling the tangled web of their relationship. A relationship built on a foundation of envy, resentment, and a desperate need for control. The evidence against Martha mounted with each passing hour. Financial records revealed suspicious transactions between Helen and Martha, large sums transferred from Helen's account to Martha's. Witnesses recounted heated arguments and whispered threats. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, revealing a friendship poisoned by envy. Riley connects the final pieces, circling Martha's photograph. She underestimated us, underestimated the power of truth. The walls were closing in on Martha. Riley says, "Apprehend Martha. We have enough to charge her with the murder of Helen Bailey." The news of Martha's arrest spread through Sunnyside like wildfire. Disbelief, shock, anger. How could the seemingly kind, grieving friend be capable of such a heinous act? Riley watched as Martha was escorted out of her house, her face now devoid of the carefully crafted mask of grief she had worn for weeks. In its place was a chilling blankness, a coldness that sent shivers down his spine. Gone was the doting friend, the heartbroken neighbour. In her place stood a woman accused of murder, her true nature revealed, her secrets laid bare. The town watched in stunned silence as she was placed in the back of the police car. The game was up. Martha, the puppeteer, had become the puppet, her carefully orchestrated charade exposed, her web of lies unraveling. As the investigation into Martha's involvement in Helen's murder progressed, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The once unassuming neighbour was revealed to be a master manipulator, her life a carefully constructed tapestry of lies and deceit. Financial records, meticulously scrutinised, revealed a pattern of Martha siphoning money from Helen's accounts. Small amounts at first, gradually increasing over time, always masked by a plausible explanation, a sob story, a fabricated crisis. Phone records showed a pattern of deleted messages, calls made at odd hours, hushed conversations hastily ended whenever Helen's name was mentioned. It was as if Martha had lived a double life, her true nature hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy. The more Riley dug, the more he realized that Martha had been playing a long game, her every move calculated, her every word designed to manipulate and deceive. The question that haunted Riley, the question that kept him up at night, was why? Why would Martha, the seemingly devoted friend, the heartbroken neighbour, kill Helen? The answer, as it often did in such cases, was a tangled mess of envy, resentment, and a desperate need for control. Helen had everything Martha craved: a loving family, a comfortable life, and a circle of friends who adored her. Martha, on the other hand, had spent years struggling financially, her marriage a distant memory, her relationship with her own children strained. Helen's happiness, her easy charm and genuine warmth had become a constant reminder of Martha's own perceived shortcomings. A seed of resentment had been planted, growing steadily over time, fueled by envy and a twisted sense of entitlement. The money, Riley realized, had been a factor, but it was more than that. It was about control, about possessing what Martha believed she deserved, even if it meant destroying the woman she claimed to love. The evidence against Martha was overwhelming. Fingerprints overlooked in the initial rush to pin the crime on Robert Clark were found on the murder weapon, a heavy candlestick hidden in Martha's attic. Fibers from Martha's favourite sweater were discovered on Helen's clothing, microscopic but damning evidence of their struggle. The burner phone, traced back to a convenience store near Martha's workplace, contained a record of calls and messages to and from Robert Clark, revealing their carefully orchestrated ruse. The anonymous letters typed on the aged typewriter found hidden in Martha's basement were the final nail in her coffin. They were a testament to her cunning, her ability to manipulate and deceive, but also to her arrogance, her belief that she could outsmart the police. Riley holds up the anonymous letters, their words stark and accusatory, a tangible manifestation of Martha's deceit. He says, "She thought she could control everything, even the truth, but the truth has a way of coming out." The trial of Martha was a media sensation. Sunnyside, once a beacon of tranquility, became a battleground for public opinion. The evidence against Martha was strong, but many refused to believe that the seemingly harmless neighbour was capable of such a cold-blooded act. The prosecution presented a compelling case, laying out Martha's web of lies, her financial motive, and the forensic evidence linking her to the crime scene. Martha's defense attorney, however, argued that the police, desperate for a conviction, had tunnel vision, focusing on Martha only after their pursuit of Robert Clark had failed. Sunnyside was torn. Neighbours who had once shared coffee and gossip now avoided each other's gaze. Friendships fractured, families divided, as the town grappled with the possibility that the woman they thought they knew was a cold-blooded killer. The trial dragged on for weeks, each day's testimony adding another layer to the complex portrait of Martha and her relationship with Helen. As the jury deliberated, the town held its breath, waiting for a verdict that would either bring closure or further divide their once peaceful community. The jury's verdict, when it finally came, was met with a collective gasp from the courtroom. Guilty. Martha, the woman who had presented herself as the grieving friend, the concerned neighbour, was found guilty of the premeditated murder of Helen Bailey. The sentence was swift and harsh. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Martha was led away, her face a mask of anger and defiance, Riley felt a sense of relief wash over him, a sense that justice, though delayed, had finally been served. Sunnyside, however, remained scarred. The idyllic facade had been shattered, replaced by the chilling realization that darkness could lurk even in the most unexpected of places. The trial was over, the verdict delivered, but the question that had haunted Sunnyside from the moment Helen Bailey's body was discovered remained. Could they ever truly heal from the wounds inflicted by one of their own? The courtroom remained hushed as the judge read out the sentence. Life imprisonment, no possibility of parole. Martha, once a pillar of the community, was now condemned to spend her days behind bars. The verdict brought a sense of finality. For Detective Riley, the weight of the case finally lifted. Justice for Helen Bailey, a woman robbed of her life. The killer wasn't a stranger. It was Martha, who had shared meals with Helen. The trial was over, the verdict delivered. The idyllic image of Sunnyside had been tarnished. The aftershocks of the trial reverberated through Sunnyside. Neighbours struggled to reconcile the Martha they thought they knew with the cold, calculating killer revealed in court. The once tight-knit community found itself fractured, divided by suspicion and a lingering sense of disbelief. Whispers followed those who had been closest to Martha. Doubt clouded their memories, their every interaction with her now subject to scrutiny, their past kindness reinterpreted through the lens of her betrayal. Even those who had never met Martha felt the shift. The tragedy had seeped into the very fabric of their lives, a constant reminder that even in their peaceful haven, evil could lurk closer than they dared to imagine. The idyllic bubble of Sunnyside had burst, leaving behind a residue of fear and suspicion. The trial might have ended, but the scars left by Martha's betrayal ran deep, a constant reminder that things were not always as they seemed. Life in Sunnyside went on, as it always does. The rhythms of daily life. Children going to school, neighbours exchanging greetings, the familiar routines slowly resumed. Yet a sense of fragility lingered, a newfound awareness of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. The community, once quick to embrace its idyllic image, now grappled with the complexity of its reality. The trial had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about their neighbours, about their town, and about the fragility of the life they had so carefully constructed. But amidst the grief and uncertainty, a quiet resilience emerged. Neighbours, once divided by suspicion, began to reach out to one another, offering support, sharing their stories, and finding solace in their shared experience. The tragedy had irrevocably changed Sunnyside, but it had also revealed its hidden strength. From the ashes of betrayal and loss, a new sense of community was being forged, one marked by empathy, understanding, and a shared determination to move forward together.